Director of Public Programs at the Library Foundation of Los Angeles. And I'm very grateful to be able to continue this series virtually, our science series, with the help from the Sloan Foundation. Today, I'm really excited to introduce two remarkable scientists, Dr. Patricia Kohl and Dr. Andrew Meltzoff. They are co-directors of the Brain and Learning Institute at the University of Washington. The institute for short is called iLabs, and we'll probably be using that shortcut as we discuss today. And this lab as a center is devoted to discovering the fundamental principles of human learning. It focuses on the first 5 years of life, and this learning would include language, social and emotional development, and cognition. And the lab uses neuroimaging tools and behavioral studies to understand the neuroplasticity, it's a word we should all have in our vocabulary, of our brains, and how to keep our brains forever nimble. Thank you for being here. Welcome, Andy and Pat. I'm going to call you that, if that's okay, during our discussion. First off, tell me about the Institute. I'm really curious to know just how you work together, how many people work at the Institute, how this happened. Just give us a sort of quick overview of how this work all began together.
Okay, well, I'll start. First of all, thanks, Jessica, for having us. I think this is such an interesting science series. So iLabs was invented to study the science of learning, to really examine how people learn. And of course, we're interested in the lifespan, but as you pointed out, those first 5 years are absolutely critical for learning. Critical periods are opening and closing across different domains. And now we've added, just 2 years ago, we've added adolescence to the group of people that we study intensely, so kids between 9 and 19. So across all of those ages, we're very interested in social, cognitive, linguistic development and how the mechanics of the brain do that work. I mean, how is it that we have such extraordinary learning skills? Amazing.
No, it's amazing. I'm going to first ask you a question, and I know this is research that was something that you conducted, several years back. But I want to just go back to your TED Talk just briefly before I want to talk about the technology in your lab. But I want to just open this up by your TED Talk when you said, babies that were 10 months and younger being citizens of the world. And that they, were able to decipher sounds and language much earlier. And I'm wondering if you could just talk to this point a little bit to tell people so they get an idea of how we're entering into the technology, and then both Andy's work and your work as things progress. But I'd love you to just speak to that.
Okay, well, the puzzle we were investigating is how it is that children learn a language. We know that kids can learn any language they're exposed to, and that there's a kind of critical period where between 0 and 7 years of age, children are geniuses, whereas we are not. So as adults, with our better cognitive skills, we are still not capable of acquiring a language as easily as the children. So we knew from various studies that sounds and words of different languages are readily processable by the brains of kids, whether they're exposed to those words and sounds or not. So they're kind of universal citizens of the world in the beginning. They can hear all these distinctions between consonants and vowels, whether it's pa, ba, or any distinction. Some languages don't use that one. And so as adults, you can't hear that distinction, like the Japanese people have trouble with R and L. But the babies don't. And so we were looking at when in development do the babies become adult citizens of the world like we are, with our more limited language-bound listening skills. So we exposed babies to a new language at 9 months, and we discovered that when they were exposed over live interaction with another adult, even though it was a very complicated situation and the person was speaking Chinese for the first time or Mandarin, the babies picked it up as though it was magic. Within 6 sessions, they looked exactly like the kids in Taiwan or China who'd been listening to that language for 11 months by that time, okay? And then we tried the same experiment over a television set. Okay, beautiful DVDs and, you know, just very high quality. And the kids looked really interested in those videos. They'd climb up to them and touch the screen. And we thought, oh, these kids are going to learn just as well. And that would be wonderful for society if you could teach the kids over a video. Lo and behold, the studies of using brain and behavior demonstrated that kids who were exposed over a video screen learned nothing. They stared at it, learned nothing. So the discovery was the social brain plays a magical role in learning, a very critical role. We need social interaction, particularly the infants and children under 2. They learn nothing from screens. And all of the studies on young children and early elementary school demonstrated a video deficit, that whenever you're trying to learn from video, and of course that's relevant to today, you don't learn. And we're adding to that behavioral research, the brain research that shows what's going on up there as you're exposed live or over a screen. And there are areas of the brain that are particularly responsive to the human interaction, areas that are responsible for the motor performance of talking back. So it gives you a clue to our evolution as humans that we need kind of sensory motor interaction. We hear and see things, we act on that information. Can't just be a couch potato and take it in. That's not what learning's about. Learning is about acting on the world. And so the studies are on very young children, but it's telling us something about how all of us learn, not only as children, but of course the teenagers and we as adults crave the stuff we get from interacting with other people. So that's how basic science discoveries on learning kind of permeate not only what we know about childhood and education, but how we think about ourselves and why it is that we need others to keep our brains really active as we age.
So what does that mean for right now in this time where we're so reliant on screens and where we're trying to figure out education for our children, and you know from not infancy but certainly from early on. I mean, you know, we hand video screens, or people do, to amuse 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds, and this goes on, or they play Baby Einstein or whatever is popular of the moment, you know, at 6 or 5 months, hoping that their children will learn things or their brains will be expanded by listening while they're in utero as soon as they come out.
Right.
What does this mean even for college remote learning? I mean, because you're dealing with up to 19-year-olds, but you know, this new moment in our history, I would think your research is pertinent and prescient in the moment.
No, it really is. It really is.
It's actually happening, you know, and the role of the screen and how limited it really is.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, we're running an experiment this last 4 months, and the results of the experiment say that we're not learning very well. The kids are not learning. You know, the kids have missed 3rd grade. I mean, they're struggling, and they learn something perhaps, but it's just not the same as face-to-face. And adults are spending all day long. We are, Andy and I are spending all day long keeping the Institute working with people at home with fancy workstations. But the communication channel, while it's good, while we love to see one another, while we love and need to exchange that information, we realize that not being able to see closely the movements and what the group is doing, what we're looking at, that information about what we're paying attention to, it's like a jump start to prefrontal cortex. It's telling us what to pay attention to if you're going to link yourself to the group. So that sense of being in the group, that sense of paying attention to body posture and everything that's going on is missing. And it's also very fatiguing to be looking constantly at the faces, trying to read information that's hard to see. So it's not the same. The good news is that we do have this technology, so we can communicate. It's essential. And the news that's one step less good maybe, but is a stimulant, is that it's not working as well. And I think companies and others are really working towards trying to understand what are the best ways to communicate over technology. How can we increase learning? What is it about the tools? The science is pointing us in the direction of we need to be able to track eye movement. We need to have the sense of others around us. Even in children, we've shown experimentally that the presence of another human being, the presence of an adult or the presence of another child will help you learn. And so that's about the biochemistry, the hormones that interact when we're together. So the science will lead the way.
I mean, I have so many questions for you, but I want to go to Andy because also what's interesting about this time, I mean, with learning from screens and COVID, and then I just want to pivot to you to talk about your work recently about studying the topic of prejudice. You've written, when I saw, you know, earlier in your work, you wrote a cited article on empathy, and a much cited article on empathy. And I wanted to talk about your work in prejudice, because this speaks to a moment right now that we're in, the development of prejudice, what you're seeing in children, and also how prejudice and empathy, since you also were saying, how they go hand in hand and what that means. If you can elaborate on that, I think it's fascinating.
No, it is very relevant to today's time. And to link to Pat's, you know, what Pat's research and other research about babies show, or very young infants, is they're like sponges picking up information from the social world. And that has a lot of positive things that very young children in preschool are learning about the culture and the way we behave in different cultures in society, what the rules and norms and standards are, and so forth. So they're sort of social pattern detectors. They are looking out at what's happening in society, culture, in their home and in the preschool, and trying to fit in and be like others. That's a very strong motivation for young children. That has all this positive aspects that they're learning quickly from us, even though we're not explicitly teaching. They're acquiring skills like sponges at the dinner table or in preschool. That has a darker side, though, and that is that they pay attention to everything we do, not just the positive things we do. And when they see their mother or father in a park or in a grocery line, and they maybe act friendly to one individual who looks in a certain way or of a certain race or has a certain set of clothing on, and act negative or frightened by or clutch the child's hand and sort of pull them closer when there's a person from a different race or with a different outfit on that the parents are not comfortable with, the child is a social pattern detector. And they are detecting that as a big signal. It's a nonverbal signal, but just as much as the verbal signals you'd like to teach, they're thinking, my mom likes this kind of person and not that kind of person. And that's the intergenerational transfer of prejudice, even though the parents don't mean to convey it. It leaks out of their behavior. So babies, of course, are not born prejudiced, but we have this recent research you referred to, actually that we just published this year, which is some experiments in the lab about how children can catch prejudice so we can watch them acquire it. And I can tell you about the experiment if it's
yeah, no, I'd love to know more about it. Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's really interesting. So please elaborate.
Okay, so we had these 4- and 5-year-old wonderful little children sit in front of a screen where we had a central adult who looked to one person on the left side of the screen or another person on the right side of the screen. And these people were randomly assigned, so they just wore different colored t-shirts. It was arbitrary. But the adult in the center would turn to one of the people on the side with a toy and say, here, this toy's for you, acting quite positively. Then they take the same toy and turn to the other side of the screen and say, ooh, this toy's for you, as if they were avoiding the person. It was negative signals that they were giving off. The children watched this wide-eyed as this little vignette played out on the screen. And then it stopped and we asked the child, just said, which of these two people on the side, which one do you like more? And about 80% of the children pointed to the adult, the person that the adult had acted positively with. And we said, who would you want to share your toy with? And they only wanted to share their own toy with the person that the adult had acted positively with. Who do you want to play with? They sort of shunned the adult, that the person that the adult in the center had acted negatively to. And so on a whole set of measures, we showed that the child caught the prejudice of the adult in the center of the screen who was dispensing positive attitude to one person and acting negatively to another. And then we did this really powerful experiment where we had those adults leave the screen and just showed new adults on either side of the screen, new adults, but they wore the same colored t-shirt, so they had the appearance, saying they shared an appearance or a feature, a colored feature of the people on either side of the screen who the adult had acted biased to or favorable to. And lo and behold, the little 4- and 5-year-olds extended the prejudice to the new person who simply looked like the old person that the adult had acted biased toward. And so we think that this observational catching of prejudice and social bias through nonverbal signals, just the way these little social pattern detectors that we have as children see us acting with others, they pick up bias that way. Of course, some kids and some families may pick up bias and prejudice because parents explicitly teach it. But there aren't that many who necessarily explicitly teach that. So their children are watching media, yes, magazines, television, yes, but to put a little more responsibility on us, they are watching us, parents, close neighbors. We are their first and best teachers. This is in preschool, the little lessons that leak out of our nonverbal behavior that we don't mean to teach, they are acquiring. So we are beginning to write papers about how this nonverbal transfer of prejudice is a very, very important channel. And we think that's a message that we would like, to share broadly in society because we didn't realize quite how powerful it was.
Wow. I had, when you were just discussing this, I had an experience. I mean, we've all had experiences, but I had an experience that really struck me during COVID. I run at a lake up here, and there was probably a child who may have been 3 years old or maybe even younger with their parent on the side of the sort of fence. And I came by, and I have a mask that I pull up when I'm around people, but otherwise I really can't breathe. So I came around and I pulled up the mask, and I saw this child just pull, their parent away from me, in a way like, oh no, this is, the whole fear around COVID, the whole fear of of interacting with others, and protecting your parent, protecting each other. And that the parent, I mean, this had become a kind of socialized activity of making sure as family you were close and protected. And I thought, wow, what about these children who grow up in this time, for the last 6 months, or going on 4 or 5 months at this point, have had this interaction with the public? How is it going to be after, So what about, there are also stereotypes and biases that you've also dealt with, and the old stereotype of girls being lousy at anything that has to do with math, engineering, and I mean, we've been hearing this since God knows when. Really, it's it almost feels like a cliche that boys, girls like English and boys like science, but I'm interested because you've done research, so you can speak to it more than just this sort of thing that people say, and you say, come on, look at all the women who are now moving into science, they're mathematicians, you know, what about the women in finance? But let's talk to this bias that's existed for so long, and what that means, and when that happens.
Right, well, that's another issue of, you know, in social equity and educational equity, that children are picking up messages from the stereotypes that the parents hold and that the teachers indeed hold. So there's a prevalent stereotype in our society, unfortunately, that girls don't do math or engineering or physics or robots. I'm trying to say words that even the audience will feel. If you say boy, girl, robot, book, which one goes with a robot? Well, boy goes more with robot and girl goes more with book. That's a stereotype, of course, because there's female engineers and there's male poets. And so it's just a stereotype. The issue is that children in our society, from our research, we've shown that about 75% of the children in Seattle have caught the stereotype that boys go with math more than girls do. And indeed, they catch that as early as second grade. And I mentioned second grade because most children are learning their multiplication tables in third grade. So these are children even before they have to memorize their multiplication tables. The little boys and little girls in class are thinking, math goes with boys. It changes their expectations and their feelings about the disciplines. So we're quite interested in that, and now are trying to develop some interventions and ways of trying to help children resist or reject stereotypes in society, because we think it can affect their learning. And of course, technology jobs, what's called STEM jobs, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, STEM jobs are quite prestigious and high-paying jobs in society today. And so that's why I mentioned it's an issue of equity. If our stereotypes and the stereotypes that teachers hold or parents hold, what toys we buy our little girls and our little boys, what books we put in front of them, what aspirations we help instill in them, if they differ for our sons and daughters, that might push some girls, not all girls, some away from mathematics or science, technology, engineering, and so forth. And that's an equity issue because of the prestige of the jobs, the flexibility of the jobs, the high pay of computer science jobs. We need to bring more women into STEM disciplines. We need more women writing code. The games can't all be designed by boys. They should be designed by women as well, and so forth. So we think we need to change that, and we are, we're trying to figure out interventions that would address it. Ironically, Pat has been interested, as you heard earlier, in languages, and she's developed interventions that would help teach language more quickly. So our institute, taken together, is interested in looking at sort of basic mechanisms about how children catch ideas and stereotypes and languages and biculturalism from the adults, but also how we could help children who are falling behind. And Pat's done a lot of really interesting work on that, on language.
Talk about that some. I mean, I'm also interested in, as we as a culture look at sexuality differently and gender differently, how this changes our notions of what is female, what is male, and how we provide the stereotypical, colors to gender, or books to gender, or aspirational books, even fantasy books of princesses and princes and all these things, how that is evolving and maybe even affecting work that you're doing. I don't know. I mean, that's just off the cuff and maybe so strange a question, but it seems like this is something that's been going on for a while, but seems to be part of our zeitgeist. So
yes, it's certainly.
Let me just jump in to say, the globalization of culture, The idea that we were becoming because economically and socially and even politically, we're all paying much more attention to what's happening in other countries. And the attitudes towards women across different countries, the attitudes towards children, where countries are willing to invest and where they're not. The situation has been much more permeable. Now, COVID will affect all that. Politics affects all that with regard to how much exchange there is going on between members of different cultures. One of the reasons I'm interested in language is that language is a pathway to culture, that the more we became bilingual like other peoples, most of the people of the world are bilingual, trilingual, they know many languages. And it helps their minds understand other cultures. It also helps their minds be more adept at creatively thinking of solutions to problems. There's something called executive functions. Executive functions is how we can switch attention and pay attention from one point of view and then another point of view. Bilinguals are excellent at executive functions. They're better than monolinguals. And in being, yeah, and their ability to switch their attention and see two different points of view actually saves them from incidents of Alzheimer's. So Alzheimer's is detected less in bilinguals than in monolinguals because they've had exercise in prefrontal cortex of switching, am I speaking French, am I speaking Spanish, or am I speaking English, with their various social partners. And so these ideas about how cultures become more understanding of one another, and that we, as global communities, take the best of all possible worlds and collaborate on solutions. It depends on us being able to permeate that culture. And I think language is one route in, and the idea that languages, and knowing many of them, actually gives us more neuroplasticity, this ability to change given new experiences, to invent a new solution. These skills are malleable. It's not that you're born with this or that. It's that early in development and throughout your life, you can shape these cognitive skills to make yourself better and live longer and live more flexibly, with more ability to learn.
As you can with behaviors,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I mean,
this is interesting to me because I, as a parent, have, my child did not go to a school that was bilingual, but I felt it was very late that they introduced languages to him. And, it seemed to be the language program for many, many schools in New York at that point, and was true, out in California where I am now. And I'm wondering, because European children, and I know some about that, not the world, but I will say, they learn multiple languages early on because of the borders of the countries that are so close, and the sense that family may live in France, but they live in Italy. And I'm wondering, is this going to change? Why are languages brought to our children so late in schooling?
Right. It's a tragedy. It's ignoring our biology. All of the science says that in the first 7 years, you have much more skill than you will have at any other time in your life at learning a second language. And so no other country is taking the approach that we're taking here in America. And so our children tend to be monolingual. But if you look at the census, every 10 years, the number of children growing up in families whose parents are speaking a language other than English grows by a factor of 3 every 10 years. And so the last census, there were 27% of the children under 5 who were learning a language other than English. And that presents a problem to the country because they'll come into the American system and have to learn in English. So we've been inventing. I went to Madrid with my whole team of researchers for 2 years in 2 separate studies, randomized control studies, where we went to the baby education centers. And they have all their kids in school, neighborhood schools. The parents pay only what they can afford. They're wonderful schools that operate all day. And we had our tutors, undergraduates at the University of Washington, went there, and for an hour a day, they would socially play with our research-based intervention and curriculum. 1 hour a day. We showed that in 18 weeks in the first study, in 32 weeks in the second study, the kids learned 5 to 10 times the number of words and phrases in English that the typical program being used in Madrid now uses. The Ministry of Education was shocked and amazed. And we've now come back, published those studies, and created software that allows us to teach any teacher, any place, this method and curriculum. And we were, except for COVID, planning to, we will be interrupted now, but we were planning to test it in California with the dual language learners starting in the fall. But COVID has interrupted all of that. We hope to get back to that work, not only in the state of California, but all over, because our children, like the rest of the children in the world, ought to be learning when learning is natural, when the brain is its most neurally plastic, in that early period where the learning is just, it's just being absorbed, as Andy said, like they're sponges. It's just social play. And so I think, you know, to bring it back to this idea that all of these methods that we're using really do rely on the social brain. And it's a new idea because we were thinking that maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we think of the logic and math and other kind of calculation type things being doing something with the left brain, and the right brain is more music, and it's more social, and it's more, you know, holistic. But now that we have imaging machines like our Meg machine, our huge $2.5 million machine, genius, safe, totally safe, we can see movies of what happens in the brain. It looks like a hair dryer from Mars. It's got this big plastic helmet, but it's totally safe and non-invasive. We're the first in the world to put little ones, 6-monthers, 2-monthers, and adults and teenagers in the machine, and we can see a movie of what goes on in the brain as a person learns. I mean, it's magical. And we can see the kinds of things that turn brains on. And using that science of, we've learned this stuff about why social is so important, why we need each other, why we look to each other, why we're motivated when others are present. And the idea is to use those facts, understand the circuitry in the brain, and then apply that to teaching, to parenting, to teaching methods, and to what happens in COVID when we're trying to learn with machines and screens. And I think it gives us a kind of holistic view that science can lead us out of this, not only the COVID, you know, the discoveries that we now need to create vaccines and to create treatments, that we should think about society as guided by research and evidence-based practices. And everything Andy's saying about avoiding the prejudice that we're now trying to deal with, to bring Black Lives Matter to the fore. We have to dig deep into our beliefs, how the brain works, that it's socially so tightly organized around social that it has this downside of creating the view of us versus them that can divide on all of these dimensions. And the interventions that we'll need right in the beginning to understand why it is that we can build prejudices, but that you can cognitively resist them and understand them. I think that gives us all hope.
Oh, it gives us hope. I also, I mean, as Andy has also looked at altruism, you know,
yes.
As we know at this point, is so important. Empathy, altruism. And studying that as well. And as you said, with the prejudice, I mean, these are things that sort of seep into others around you, and that we model that.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess my last question to both of you, and you sort of synopsized everything at the end, but and this is to both of you, really, you know, what do you think with this research, what you're saying, what with technology being so much of the way that we guide ourselves, our youth, such an indicator of so much that people are quickly famous because they're on Instagram. I mean, that our world is surrounded by images and that are generated on a screen. That our interaction with each other is seemingly limited as we move forward, and certainly youth spending a lot of time, and that also has become a kind of cliche that you can't take a phone away from somebody under the age of 18 or 21, or people in their 30s, or eating with your phone next to you, all of these things. What does that mean as we go forward, as far as education, as far as socializing? This is a very dark period when it comes to that right now. but what does it mean for us in the future? I mean, you've utilized technology to help you to discover all these things. But what do you see really looking at more closely in the next couple of years because of this moment right now?
Well, one of the things that I'd like to mention is just from a parental point of view, it's sort of age related, Jessica. That is to say that technology does a lot of wonderful things. We could not be having this interview or communicating now because we're in the middle of COVID if we weren't doing it over a screen and technology. We could not be studying how children learn and safely understanding what's going on behind those beautiful brown eyes of theirs as they're thinking, watching their mother, hearing her voice, feeling a touch. We could not explore without the brain imaging device, which is technology. But technology does all these wonderful things, and it's quite helpful for sort of older children and adults. As it turns out, in the first roughly 2 years of life, 3 years of life, children learn best and first from social interaction. And there really isn't a substitute for our little 6-month-old looking into mother and father or caretaker's eyes and being held and touched and bounced and face-to-face interaction. Not face to screen, but face-to-face. And this is COVID now, but I think we can all remember how rewarding face-to-face interaction was, and touching somebody's shoulder to comfort them, and just being in the presence of people we love and feeling that. Well, it turns out that our little babies and our young little children who are expecting that, and more profoundly, their brains are expecting face-to-face interactions. Their brains did not evolve to interact with just this flat screen. It's not two-dimensional. It doesn't touch you. It cannot respond as contingently on a screen as we can in person. And so my point here is just that it's not so much, to me, technology good versus technology bad. As a developmental psychologist, I'm very interested that it's age dependent. I'm pretty convinced that in the first 2 and 3 years of life, it's all about the social interaction and face-to-face with your child. They haven't graduated yet to Zoom. They're on face-to-face, and they need you now. Now, it turns out technology interacts with that because the mother, father, caretaker may have a phone around. And when they're interacting with their baby and the phone rings, they're in the middle of something that makes sense for this baby. Then the phone rings and the parent turns to the side, picks up the phone, and does this mysterious thing of talking into a hunk of plastic in thin air. Hello, yes, we can do this at dinner today. It must be bizarre to a little child to see that.
Yeah.
So we're suddenly ignoring our child, and they learn those social pattern lessons too.
Mm-hmm.
I talked about how they learn bias from behavior that we don't intend. Kids catch stereotypes by things we don't intend. They learn about love and attention and how much we're devoted to another person also by how we behave. Putting the little baby on pause while you handle your phone call, the baby's learning how to become human, what we do in this culture. That child later.
They make toy phones for a reason.
So technology is a great help. That's allowing this, and it would not make sense to, want to throw out technology. But I think as parents and as educators, we do need to understand that children sometimes learn better from in-person teaching when it's safe, and parental love, in person. And all that has to be woven in to these current times. That's the challenge and interesting thing of living here in 2020.
Yeah, absolutely. Pat, do you have any?
Well, I mean, just a closing thought. We're doing, you know, the new experiments are always fun. So what we're doing now, what we were doing up until the lab was closed, we're actually looking at what happens in the brain when two people are interacting. These studies are called face-to-face neuroscience. And one person, sometimes a baby, sometimes an adult, is in the big meg machine, and the other person is interacting with them, you know, just right there, but also has wiring on the head, sensors, and the computing equipment integrates those two streams of brain interaction and looks at the dependencies between one brain and another. As it's kind of sci-fi-ish, but as they interact socially in a totally natural, positive way, and then we ask what happens when that person abruptly turns away. So exactly the scenario that Andy just raised, which is mom is talking to the baby and they're cooing back and forth at each other, and everything is going well, and then suddenly the mother just turns and she either speaks to someone else, or she does this, or she does this, and we look at what happens to the baby brain. And so this sense, and whether it's two adults interacting or a child and a parent, the brain reacts instantaneously to that rejection. You know, a surprise, this element of surprise lights up an area of the brain. And there is this.
You know, I do too when somebody in the middle of a conversation takes. I always.
This is why we have rules. I was going to suggest earlier, parents really do need some rules around the dinner table. Andy and I need some rules. All of us who are joining each other at dinner really don't want the other person to be picking up the phone midstream or looking down at the phone. Or when, you know, we had a daughter who was looking down at her phone on her lap, there were rules. I mean, parents have to set rules. This time is precious. This time when we can interact with one another and have dinner and share our days, these are precious times. And again, to echo what was said, these are habits that you form, habits and practices about what does dinner mean? What is it about when we sit down to share a meal and share our thoughts and our experiences? It's how we bond. And so I think parents setting rules about when technology is let in and when it's out are good things. Good for us, good for them. And it helps us control what is otherwise a constant distraction. Because if you've got your phone on all the time, it's always beeping and buzzing and grabbing you away. And even we need this sense of focus and limitation on what we'll let it do to us.
Right. I think we have to be more cognizant, what you're both saying is of our behaviors, and not think that, you know, they're not catchable or not, you know, modeled by those around us and how we feel. I mean, when you said it's not even sci-fi, it just it reminds me of like movies from 20 years ago, like Look Who's Talking, where the parent turns around, the baby sort of says, you know, in an adult voice out of this baby's face, like, "What are you doing? I need some attention too," you know. I really, the work you're doing is remarkable, and it's so interesting to speak to both of you about it. And I really thank you for your time and this.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Jessica.
Fun talking with you.
Lovely to talk to you guys. Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.